Hey everybody, this is Perch. I've talked before about kind of the era of comics I love the most, and that is the '80s. But that's not a hard and fast rule. I have comics that I have loved from all different eras, from the '70s, from the '60s, from the '90s, from last year, from last month. There's almost always comics I love, but per capita, by by mass, that's a weird word to use in a comic video. The '80s tended to have the stuff I enjoy the most. Uh, I will say as we get into this, before I kind of make my case, and by the way, people ask always what's my favorite era of comics. This is it. I'm not sure completely why you're asking, but this is I'll try and give my reasons as we go. But the elephant in the room with all of this is it has been, I think, proven many times over that whatever era you quote unquote got into comics, when you actually started reading a lot of comics and you actually started collecting a lot of comics, when your interest either went from very very small to large, or when you were introduced to it for your first time, that tends to be the era you enjoy the most. There's a lot of evidence that shows that that's the case. So if you start reading the comics in the '80s, you're most likely to view the '80s as your favorite timeline. Now, why is that? I don't know. I think there's a enjoyment in discovery that kind of goes on there. That there's this, you're finding something new for the first time, and it's exciting. And I think that that's a large part to do with it. But there's a number of reasons. There's a number of things out there, but a lot of it is, when it's fresh and new, it's your first memories. Your first memories are often good ones. You tend to erase the bad memories over time, and that's why when people go back and they're like, "Man, I love this comic," they read it and they're like, "Oh, like I recently did with Miss Marvel. I remember I had it in my head like, oh, that original series in the '70s was pretty fun. There's some good stuff in there." And then I go back and read it. And I'm like, "Oh, this is kind of terrible." But anyway, um, it's just funny how that works. But I think the '80s. So here's my defense of the '80s and why I think things were a little different. Um, the biggest one, and I think this is probably like 75% of the reason, is that creative teams, writers and artists, but especially the writers, were given much longer runs. You had people who would be on books for years, and it was pretty common that you would talk, 50 issue runs or more. Joe and I did that video on Captain America. It's like this is a 10-year Mark Grunwald run on the comic. Now, was everything good in that run? Absolutely not. And some of the individual comics certainly have aged poorly, or they're not as good as I remember. That same effect. However, the entire run holds up. The stuff he was doing, and I think that there's an easy benefit to having long runs. The writer has the breathing room to actually set up subplots, to take their time in terms of introducing characters and introducing conflicts. And they don't feel like they have to hotshot a storyline. They don't feel like they have to cut corners to get you to, learn about something. They can actually, build it up like a proper story and introduce those concepts in the comics. So I think that if you give people longer time, same thing goes for artists as well. If you look at John Romita Jr., Paul Smith, even John Byrne, take a look at early X-Men John Byrne when he was first coming out of that title, and then look at his end of the title. And you will notice that Byrne clearly gets more comfortable with the characters. The same thing is true with Fantastic Four. The same thing is true, frankly, with the She-Hulk. If you look at how he becomes more comfortable with drawing the character, this is normal. I think the writers become more comfortable writing the character. And I think that you get a lot of subplots and other elements. Like was mentioned elsewhere, Chris Claremont is highlighted and credited for amazing subplots in X-Men. And and absolutely, he definitely was doing that. And it was wonderful. But it wasn't just Claremont. Stern was doing this. Grunwald was doing this. Lots of people were doing subplots. And it was just, that was the style at the time. You had this idea that I'm on the title for a long time, so I can have a main story. I can have some backup stories. I mean, lots of people were doing this. And I think the quality was definitely there. So to me, if I think about the '80s and I think about one element that's fundamentally different in comics, it's that. It's actually, I think I could do some some actual data gathering on this, but I think that era had the highest volume with the longest runs of creators on books of any other decade we've had. I think the 70s, there was a lot of new comics being introduced and a lot of starting and stopping, and DC was trying to hold on to some things outside the superhero genre, and there's a lot going on in the 70s, which did result in shorter runs. The 80s had long runs. The 90s had severe upheaval all over the place, and then since that time, the publishers in the 2000s, the 2010s, there's been far more desire of, as soon as a writer gets relatively hot, you move them. So you get like a 2 year or 3 year run on a book, but writers move around a lot more, and artists, that is completely gone. The idea of having one artist on a book for more than like 30 uninterrupted issues. I mean, unless you're talking about one of the indies, forget it. Just doesn't happen. So that's a huge part of the 80s there. The other one for me, if I'm thinking about some of the other pieces, the 80s was a lot more experimental than I think people give it credit for. I've heard this criticism, and I've seen it on a number of sites, a number of blogs, where they talk about how the 80s were very formulaic, and there was just one kind of comic, one kind of story that was being told. But I don't think that really vets out. There were a lot of different things happening. I do think superheroes were at the top, and that was what people focused on. But at the same time, it was there was more variety in story. You could pick up different comics that Marvel was putting out at the time and get different tones, and you were seeing a very big difference in terms of the variety of the stories within the superhero genre. I think if you go further back, go into the 70s, you get more romance, you get more horror, you get different things, different genres completely. And I would argue even now, if you're willing, and I'm always surprised that people aren't, to stop holding your nose and buy a comic that's not a Marvel or a DC book, there's a ton of varieties out there. There's sword and sorcery, there's fantasy, there's horror, there's magic, there's plenty of slice of life. There's a little bit of everything today. It's just you have to go outside the big two. The big two seem to kind of have one genre, and then they fool around with it. Like, it's a superhero book, but we'll put some horror elements into it, or it's a superhero book, but we'll put some slice of life into it. That's not quite the same. It's not really leading with the genre like they have in the past. Um, and the last thing I'll throw out about the 80s, kind of in defense of it, is that you saw artists. I think you saw that the companies were giving artists more freedom is the wrong word, but more support. I think you did see a penciler and an inker, and you saw these as very defined roles, and you would see the value of inking. You'd see that if you put a penciler on this book, you would see uh, real effort in terms of the style of inking and kind of the quality of the title that was being put together. And now what you see is a rush for speed, digital, and all in one. Penciler and inker, just one person, and that's what they're going to do, in the end. And I think that has that's been to the detriment of comics. I think that's not helping people who are artists on books actually grow in their skills. They're just trying to crank stuff out as fast as they can, and that is when will we see the effect of creators getting better on a title the longer they're with it? Like, is that even possible anymore? Um, I've watched Ed McGuinness on the Avengers lately, and in many cases, his work, he doesn't seem to be having that same benefit. He's a good artist, but you don't see that kind of natural feeling for these characters because he's constantly bouncing in and out of the title, and it doesn't feel like he's being given that support. And then again, if you're trying to pencil and ink in one, then there's less flexibility to adapt your style. And I think that the 80s, you saw, I want to say a real, well, I mean, this is, I guess, the argument I make. The 90s are known for some amazing artists doing some amazing things. And the whole image revolution was built on art, that these artists wanted this profile. I would argue that if the 80s had not structured itself in such a way that these creators could come in and learn their craft and get really good at it, if the 80s hadn't been the way they were, I don't think we would have seen the talent in the 90s. If you look at early Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee and Mark Silvestri and Rob Liefeld, you'll see that their styles from when they first came in. I'm not talking about when Jim Lee first started doing X-Men. I'm talking earlier than that. I'm talking the Mockingbird backup story in Solo Avengers, or Jim Lee was doing some stuff in that What the comic I talked about a few days ago. That's early Jim Lee. Talking about Todd when he was doing some of the DC work. The style were there, the talent was clearly there, but they had the ability to kind of learn and hone their craft and work with an inker and get things solid. I mean, I think Todd's run on Spider-Man, because he had such a long, unbroken run on that book, helped him learn himself and get better, and that obviously paid off then down the road. So I think that handling of talent in the '80s is really it's underrepresented, underappreciated, and I think you could make a very strong argument that we're not going to see the same kind of amazing art era in the future, because we're not doing the homework or the groundwork or the prep work with artists to help them become the amazing creators they are. They don't have the opportunity anymore, so I don't think we're going to see the benefit in the end. But anyway, those are some of my thoughts on the '80s. That's why I like the era. What about you? What's your era that you like? And does any of what I've said ring home? Does that sound ring home? Is that a word? I don't know. Anyway, like and subscribe, and thanks for listening.